Well, perhaps we'll get started.
Sure.
So I want to say hello and welcome to our series on racism, discrimination, and othering, perspectives from around the world. I'm Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Alanson White Institute of Psychoanalysis, Psychiatry, and Psychology. Before I introduce today's guest speakers, I would like to thank members of the Institute's administration who have made our series possible. Dr. Elizabeth Krimendahl, the director, Mr. Richard Herman, Director of Administration, John Aumann, and Elizabeth Rodman. I am also very grateful for the work of the members of my committee, Max Belkin, Karen Gennaro, Anton Hart, Tom Hennis, Gurmeet Kanwal, Catherine Nordzi, Vlad Novak, Jean Petroselli, Hopton Shaw, David Solomon, Masato Tsujikawa, and Cleone White. Thank you to all of you for your hard work on this program. And welcome now to our participants from around the globe. We have people attending today from India, China, Japan, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Panama, Argentina, Peru, Brazil, Norway, Canada, the UK, Australia, Albania, Bulgaria, and many states in the US. I also want to thank everyone who submitted questions for our speakers. We will try to address as many as possible. During our meeting, you may also add questions today using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The chat function does not work, but please put your questions in the Q&A button. I will now turn the program over to my colleague, Dr. Gurmeet Kanwal, who will introduce today's session and our guest speakers. Dr. Kanwal is Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Weill Medical College of Cornell University and Supervising Psychoanalyst at the William Alanson White Institute. He is past president of the William Alanson White Psychoanalytic Society and an editorial board member and fellow of the College of International Journal of Psychoanalysis and editorial board member of Psychoanalytic Discourse. Gurmeet?
Thank you, Maria. Ahlan fi Yoa'd walara. Salam alaikum. How did I do that?
That was great, Gurmeet.
Right, good. Welcome to everyone attending from around the world. Before I introduce today's panelists, I just wanted to say a couple of words. You know, whether you see each other or not, and I know you don't, you know, let's just try to visualize this small global community that has come together to listen to today's talk. Let's use our gift for imagination and think of ourselves as sitting around a campfire talking about, you know, something that is very, very important in today's world. Maria has already mentioned that there's, you know, close to 400 people who registered from countries all over the world, as she listed. I think in addition to the ones she said, there are attendees from Iran. You know, it's quite an amazing thing to think about, that we are all sitting together trying to talk about oppression and marginalization and alienation in communities around the world. And who knows, you know, someday perhaps we will all actually be able to be together in a physical space. We certainly hope that this series will be going on for over this year, but maybe into the next year. And perhaps by that time, there will be an opportunity to get together and to actually see ourselves as a small global group that is concerned with these issues. And I hope that day can come. So in a way, this series of talks is sort of our chance to allow the subaltern of the world to have a voice. And whenever one tries to do that, there are bound to be responses and reactions, and there certainly have been already some to today's talk, which is focused on the experience of people from the occupied Palestinian territories. But that is part of the course. And, you know, if that was not happening, then we wouldn't be doing the right thing. It's proof that we're doing something important and useful. Um, and the other thing I think to keep in mind is that even though the series of talks is meant to help us understand the experience of oppression and marginalization and racism in all these communities around the world, to understand the local experience, yet at the same time, it's not really possible to do that justice without keeping in mind that the experience of oppression and marginalization around the globe has been deeply impacted and continues to be impacted by the policies and power and politics of the imperial nations and entities through the course of history, you know, like the British Empire or the United States of America. So while we are talking about local experience, it's also important to keep in mind that we're also talking about oppression and marginalization on a global scale, and, you know, who has the power over whom now and has had through our history. So keeping that in mind, I have the pleasure of introducing today's panelists. Yoa'd Ghanadry-Hakim is a clinical psychologist and supervisor and has been active in the field of mental health in Palestine for 25 years. She specializes in trauma, abuse, and severe mental health problems. She works at the Palestinian Counseling Center in occupied Jerusalem and the West Bank, and is head of the Arab Union of Psychologists, Israel. A human rights activist, Yoa'd has been involved with the Psychosocial Support Program for Palestinian Refugees, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency in the Near East West Bank, and is a founding and steering committee member of the Palestinian Global Mental Health Network. And I'm pleased that Yoa'd will also be on a panel with me in March at the Division 39 conference. Lara Shihai is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the George Washington University Professional Psychology Program. She works on decolonial struggles, as well as power, race, class, and gender constructs, and dynamics within psychoanalysis. Lara is the secretary of the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Society, and is the chair of the Teachers Academy of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She's co-editor of Studies in Gender and Sexuality and Counterspace in Psychoanalysis, Culture, and Society, and serves on the editorial board for the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Lara is on the advisory board of the USA Palestine Mental Health Network and Psychoanalysis for Pride, and a member of the Task Force for Indigenous Psychology. She also has a forthcoming co-written book with Stephen Shihai titled Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, published by Routledge. Welcome to you both, and thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Gurmeet. صباح الخير، أهلا وسهلا بالجميع وخصوصي باللي عم بيتابعونا من فلسطين ولبنان وكل البلاد العربية. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And a special shout out to those of you who are joining us from Palestine, from Lebanon, and from the Arab world and all around the world. Thank you to the Institute, Gurmeet, and the committee for the invite. My name is Lara Shihai, and I'm coming to you from occupied Pamunkey Confederacy land. Land acknowledgements to me are important anytime we speak, but especially when we're talking about Palestine and we take up trauma in the context of settler colonialism and talk about land back projects. This is also a part of a larger commitment for me that I've been working on, and a call for our field to work towards reclaiming disavowed truths in service of attending to racial and historical trauma, as many Indigenous scholars have already taught us, including those from Palestine. So today it's my utmost honor and pleasure to have Yoa'd join us today. She's a comrade, a friend, and a dear colleague who I've grown to know over the past several years, and working alongside her, learning and unlearning with her in Palestine. I'm beyond excited to have her voice represented in this series, to have Palestine recognized as a site of trauma, but also a site of livability, as Nadira Shalhoub-Kabrukian reminds us. And most importantly, as an urgent ethical imperative of where our attention and energies as clinicians, scholars, and activists needs to be directed in the service of liberation. And without further ado, تفضل Yoa'd. Do you want me to start the PowerPoint?
كمان شوي. شكرا كثير لارا. Thank you for everyone who's joining us. شكرا لأهلي وعائلتي وزملائي وأصحابي بفلسطين اللي دايما عم تدعموني وبترافقوني. تأمل ما نضطرش نضلنا نحكي حكايتنا كمان سنين طويلة لقدام يعني. Thank you, William Alanson White Institute. Thank you, Gurmeet and Maria, for this opportunity to share voices about Palestine from Palestine. Thank you for all the program committee and people around the world that are joining us today. Let me start, Lara Habibti. As usual, I like usually to start by telling something about my own experience with what happened when I tried to register to this seminar, Lara. Actually, when I did so, we had an online application, and I was filled of worry that I will not, as usual, find the name of Palestine in the listed states that were there. While this wasn't the case of this seminar, but it is usually the case of hundreds of seminars, lectures, even film online festivals, and other research questionnaires that whenever Palestinians are required to be identified, we can't present ourselves as Palestinians, and we find ourselves automatically looking for Israel as the second alternative, which means that automatically we think of finding another way to be listened to and shown to the others. And this is exactly what happens in Palestine, that Palestinians, or there was a try to erase Palestine and establish instead of Palestine something else. And while we were working together, Lara, we talked about it a lot. And Kaman Marra, thank you for teaching me how to look at this situation from also a global perspective, not only a local perspective. So please, can you now share, I will share with you some pictures that exactly show the larger issue of erasing one nation and trying to put another instead of it. So I will share some of our local lenses, what happens in Palestine through our Palestinian lenses, okay? Next, please, Lara. It all began in 1948 or even before. Actually, when usually you ask Palestinians to identify themselves or ask them where are they from, they'll tell you they are from Haifa, Nazareth, Akko, Ramallah, all cities in Palestine. While when you ask Israelis where are they from, they will tell you they came from Russia, Poland, the United States, or even Baghdad. But when you say that Palestinians are from Palestine, while Israelis came from elsewhere, you will be accused of hate speech. Actually, only naming the facts and stating these facts will you will be accused of developing or promoting a hate speech. And this is exactly how settler colonialism works. Next, Laura, please. Please have a look on the yellow color, and this is the map of Palestine, and this is the historical Palestine before the 1948. Next. In 1947, the UN General Assembly took an action, a partition plan, which was named or called 181 Partition Plan. And according to this plan, the land of historical Palestine was supposed to be divided into two states, one Arabic states and the other is the Jewish state. The yellow parts are those for the Palestinian states. In that year, Palestinians and the years before and after, Palestinians were expelled from their homeland. And now we have around 12 million Palestinian refugees all around the world, while settlers Jewish settlers came to Palestine in order to establish their new state. Next, please. In 1967, UN Security Council Resolution 181 again shrinked the area of Palestine and gave more areas for the Israeli part. And actually, Palestinians remained with only 22% from their original historical land. And we will reach till today. Next, Clara. This is the situation today. We as Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza, we supposedly are supposed to own only 14% of our land. And if you can see now how the map of our homeland and Palestine was shrinked more and more without naming also the deal of the century, the so-called deal of the century of Trump that wanted to shrink this area more and more. Next, Clara. Actually, today the red areas are West Bank and Gaza, and as you can see from the picture in front of you, there is no continuous geographic area between Gaza and West Bank, which means a Palestinian can't be in Gaza and just go to West Bank without entering Israel. And now with the closure on Gaza, there is no way to enter or be out of Gaza without Israeli military permissions. Okay, next. You remember the 14% of our land. This is the area of the West Bank, but from this area, Israel has built a wall, apartheid separation wall that surrounds all the area of the West Bank. They built colonies, settler colonies inside the West Bank area, and they put more than 300 checkpoints and barriers within the area that is supposed to be a free movement and out of restriction area for the Palestinians. So we have settlements, we have the wall, we have bypass roads for the settlers, and we have more than 300 checkpoints in West Bank. Next, Clara. Can you just continue all the area? The separation wall takes more than 9% of the area that was supposed to be for the Palestinians. The settlements area east of the wall are 8%, the Jordan Valley settlements control around 29%, which means that Palestinians are left with around 55% only from the areas that they were supposed to live in. So whenever you go to Google and you go to Wikipedia and just try to find some facts about Palestine, you will see there that everyone is calling it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Palestine-Israel conflict. But we in Palestine, we don't see it as a conflict. We see it, the word conflict is a distortion of reality actually. We see it as a movement for settler colonialism, aiming at vanishing one community and building and putting instead of it another community. With all these maps, maybe I can take a moment and show them more, Lara, about what does, for example, the wall mean or checkpoint means. Thank you for helping me in this. This is the separation wall. Israel, a number of years ago, built a wall that is 708 kilometers around the West Bank. It's about 440 miles. The wall actually, 80% of the wall is inside Palestinian territories, inside Palestinian areas. In some parts of it, it's 6 kilometers inside Palestinian areas. The separation wall separates actually Palestinians from Palestinians. If you live in one city in Palestine, in Jericho, for example, and you want to go to another city in Palestine, which is Bethlehem, you will be stopped by checkpoint and you will meet the separation wall and you will need the permit of the Israeli military forces in order to enter your homeland. So the separation wall is separating Palestinians from Palestinians. And maybe, Lara, this is the picture that you see, the beautiful lady down the picture. This is Lara. Lara visited us in Palestine. So maybe, Lara, it's an opportunity that you share with us. How did you feel when you just walked around this huge, ugly apartheid wall?
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Yoa'd. And I'm hearing from Gurmeet that there's a little bit of echo from your side, if you can come a little bit closer when you talk. But I think part of what Yoa'd and I, when we were talking about what did we want to show our audience today, we're aware that many of you might know the realities of Palestine. Many of you are have been aware for quite some time. And part of the settler colonial narrative is also to obfuscate realities, truths on the ground. For example, there's a lot of consternation when we call the wall the apartheid wall, but that is why we wanted to show you images that locate in person. It's really hard to explain how massive, how daunting, how utterly oppressive the apartheid wall is. And we tried as best as possible to show you a photo that might locate an embodied space, what the wall looks like. Those of you who have seen me in person know that I'm not diminutive. I'm not super tall, but I'm not diminutive. And this is the magnitude of the wall. I personally have been involved in the struggle for Palestinian liberation for countless years, and nothing could have prepared me for the feeling of being face to face with this wall, with this monstrosity, with this oppressive sort of embodiment of settler colonialism and enclosure, literal enclosure. So as you can see, one of the things that is heavily debated in Palestinian circles and Palestinian scholarly work is, do you beautify the part of the technology of occupation, one of which is the apartheid wall? Some folks would say, yes, this is what Palestinians look at every day. This is in Beit Lahem, it's in Bethlehem, not less than a mile away from one of the key clinics that my good friend and colleague Ghanadry-Hakim works at. And you walk out, and within 2 minutes, you come upon this massive wall. This other, I'll just sort of locate this picture here. This is the left side of the wall. As you can see, the barbed wire is right there, and a playground is right next to it. It's part of the reasons why we wanted to show you these images themselves, to locate how imbricated this oppression is, how absolutely central to the experience of all Palestinians. To imagine children's view being the Apartheid Wall, whereas several years prior, this wall did not exist. And what technologies of oppression and settler colonialism do is create a new reality, new narratives on the ground, where this becomes part of the central feature of topography, where the Apartheid Wall is inextricably linked to the Palestinian experience. The baby that's born after the wall only knows that wall there. And yet people like Yoa'd, as you're telling me, Yoa'd, is that you have memories of the Apartheid Wall not being there. You live of a time and of course, of a generation where Palestine is Palestine, with no Apartheid Wall. Now, I see Palestine still as it is with the Apartheid Wall overlaid on it, but it's undeniable what the magnitude of the wall in space in Palestine. This other photo right here shows you, this is what next where I'm walking is one side of the wall, but if you can see to the back how the wall snakes around and literally encloses entire spaces, including folks' homes. There are stories of people who are literally encased entirely into the wall, meaning every time you walk in and out of your home, you are walking through a checkpoint. What you don't see in these photos is the towers in which the Israeli occupation forces sit, towers where the occupation forces can see everything, but people on the ground can not see if there's somebody there. For those of us who are clinicians and who work with issues of trauma, it probably isn't surprising to see that even if you are not being watched, there's always the feeling of being surveilled. And maybe Yoa'd, you can talk a little bit more about that piece, the invisibility but hyper visibility of oppression and how that ties into the trauma that you're talking about.
Yeah, shukran, Lara. I will come to that. Maybe, first of all, I think we as nations, as international community, as Palestinians, we must put an end to this apartheid wall. As long as people just hear about it and do nothing about it, it's very negative, it's very bad. I think it's an ethical obligation of us as human beings to stand together to put an end to this oppression of daily oppression of Palestinians. And actually this wall is a try from Israel to put Palestinians in a huge jail. And if we come to the next slide, Lara, I talked about the 300 checkpoints all around West Bank. These are photos from the checkpoint of Bethlehem, I think, where Palestinians are trying just to get to their work. This is a everyday morning picture for Palestinians. People are trying to go to their work and they have to stand in these lines, sometimes for hours, in order just to go for their work, including me. I'm a psychologist, I'm a therapist, I'm a supervisor, I'm a university lecturer, and still I have to go through this hell sometimes on weekly basis. Others must go through this hell on daily basis. And you can just imagine how people feel when you ask them just to be there, oppressed and humiliated. What does this make to our inner mental health? This is a way to destroy Palestinians, and usually the soldier on the checkpoints ask us to be polite and to be civil, and to act in a like normal and a polite way on these checkpoints, while this checkpoints is everything but normality. Everything is against normal and ethical human situation, human relation. So, and through these checkpoints, my patients or our patients has to come to clinic. So imagine if we just go through the general normal Western plan of seeing a patient on time, by time, for 50 minutes. Does it work? You all go to your work and you invest your energy on your target, which is your service, your work. But my people, vast majority of their energy is invested on roads, on just reaching to their work, not on their work itself. People go to their work very tired, very exhausted, because a large portion of our energy is invested or thrown on the roads. We can stop this, Lara, and I will.
Yeah. I wanted to say one word about this. Number one, a thank you to Baha Abu Shanab, who is a photo journalist and filmmaker, who generously shared these photos with us. And I want to, those of us whose work is with the unconscious, I want us to sort of take these pictures in with Fanon's words in mind, how the oppressed are presumed guilty, and to understand how the architecture of oppression, in this case, a checkpoint, positions people to be taken in and received already as the unconscious code of criminality, right? When you put people in cages, when you have them rank and file, when you have them on top of each other, what does it do internally, both in terms of how we receive them, how we read them, and the spaces in which they find themselves legible, right? There's no way around the dehumanization that is pulled out of people when they are required not only to go through this every day, but to stand packed, be yelled at by soldiers, asked to be, as Yoa'd was saying, single file in spaces that don't allow for that. And what happens both on the internal space of the person, but then also how do they continuously have a feedback loop of being received already as uncivilized, as needing to be controlled because they're unruly. And these are the sorts of mechanisms that justify further oppression. So the language and structure and architecture of settler colonialism is always a feedback loop that reifies the oppression that happens, because it creates a possibility where now we have to control these bodies, right? I went through checkpoint 300 once. Actually, Yoa'd was on the other side waiting for us. I happened to go through it at the end of the day where traffic is opposite, so it was empty. But even the humiliation of walking through turnstiles, you have to work through turnstiles to come in. So after this point, there's turnstiles you go through one by one. There are surveillance cameras. There are people behind plexiglass that don't look at you. There's marks that say Palestinians and then other folks. And it happened to be that after this one time, I went to South Africa right after it and visited the Apartheid Museum. And anybody who has been to South Africa and visited the Apartheid Museum, they give you a sort of random card that allows you to go through one turnstile or another, one for whites, one for blacks. And it was harrowing to see that I had just experienced this in real time in Palestine. And I'm not Palestinian, and I have the luxury and the privilege of traversing these checkpoints with, for me, a Canadian passport. And so there's something so real when you have maybe something to compare it to that we all know in our consciousness. But Yoa'd, I'm sure you have other aspects of this to add to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then we can turn to our conversation.
Yeah. I will add to this. First, I think that Israel is taking a systematic measures that goes beyond land and building. It aims at destroying the mental health of the Palestinians. It aims at destroying the social structures and the relations and the well-being of Palestinians. Another devastating example is the house demolitions. You know, in each year, Palestinians get orders by the Israeli authorities that their house should be demolished because their houses are built illegally. Though some of these houses were built even before the establishment of the State of Israel. How can these houses be illegal if the State of Israel wasn't there? People were in Palestine before settlers came as immigrants from all over the world and claimed this land is theirs. And a number of years ago, Israel started operating a new policy in which it's called by your own hands. For example, 82% of Palestinians that received or instructed to demolish their houses, they were instructed to demolish their houses by their own hands. Otherwise, they're expected to pay a huge fine or to be in prison. So just imagine a father that stands in front of a conflict. Either he or she, a mother, demolish their own houses in front of their children, or they will be jailed. And sometimes I feel, Laura, it's like you're being raped, and then you're being asked to abuse yourself, while paying for your abuser or paying for your rapist to see you abusing yourself or raping itself. And I think on the emotional level, it's a tragedy. And there have been some researchers taking place in Palestine, one done by the Palestinian Counseling Center, and it showed that people that demolish their houses, Palestinians that demolish their houses by their own hands, they were much more traumatized and injured, psychologically injured, more than those that chose to pay the fine or to go to the prison. And if we talk about prison, another number that might interest you, since the 1967, 700,000 Palestinians were jailed or detained in Israeli prisons or detention centers. When we talk about 700,000 Palestinians, we're talking about 1/5 of the Palestinian people. 1/5 of my people were imprisoned or were put in detention centers. The statistics says, Israeli statistics, okay, says it's one child per day that is being jailed in Israeli prisons or detention centers. In 2015, we had in 1 month more than 165 children put in jail and detained in Israeli, through Israeli military or justice system. These numbers are huge. These numbers means that all the Palestinian people are confronting a massive destruction mechanism or a policy. And our trauma isn't post-trauma. Usually the international community likes very much to use the term PTSD, where P stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. But in Palestine, we are never post the trauma. We live the trauma on everyday basis. It's a continuous cumulative trauma taking place everywhere in a very systematic way.
Yeah. One of the things you're bringing up, Yoa'd, is the idea of taking this example or taking this opportunity to look at these things as structural issues. They're not individual, right? And those of us in the context of the United States or in other places might hear a parallel to how we might talk about state violence or carceral violence or law enforcement violence against Black folks in the United States being structural, not individual. And we also hear the other narrative, and this is, I think, very alive and well, of, well, for example, well, if you just followed the rules, this wouldn't happen to you. Or if you listened to the cop, you wouldn't have gotten shot. Or worse, looking at the person's individual history. What did they do? What was their criminal history? What would they like as a character? I hear this, of course, a lot too in the narrative of Palestine. Now, I can see it as a structural narrative of oppression, right? To release the oppressor from the guilt of oppressing, you find justifications for the reasons why such oppression might be needed. But I'm wondering if you can speak to what is it like for you to hear, or as a Palestinian and a Palestinian clinician, when you've heard this from your patients? And I know because I've had these conversations with you about what is it like when you hear that narrative or that tinge of a narrative that says, well, maybe you need checkpoints because you are you commit violence, or that we are demolishing your homes because one person in the family is, suspected of committing violence. Any of these narratives, what would be your response, especially if you're taking up what you're saying is that this is a systemic policy of oppression and racial traumatization of Palestinians?
Okay, thank you, Lara. First, let me clarify that the vast majority of houses demolished, they were not in whatsoever part of a resistant activation or committee or any act. It's just demolishing orders for illegally building your own house upon your own land. I think that resistance is very healthy. It's the only way Palestinians can continue, because it can continue as a nation and can continue as normal. Keeping us normal means that you can never adopt the narrative of your abuser. You're asking us, the international community, or those that are accusing Palestinians of being guilty, they are accusing us of resisting the narrative of our rapist, of our abuser. And this is the healthier action we as Palestinians take. We don't agree to the distortion of reality, and we stick to our right, and we stick to our inner truth that this is our homeland, and all the actions that are taken around us are illegal, unhuman, and resistant is the way to respond to that. In Palestine, as a clinician, we choose some ways to resist, We resist by offering our people therapy in Arabic. We offer them local tools in therapy. We work through Palestinian organizations. We establish unions. We established the Arabic Union for psychologists inside what is called Israel, and we established the Palestinian Global Mental Health Networks. We established collective narrative that oppose the narrative of the abuser. And maybe for me as Yoa'd, let me tell you also, you know, Lara, I came from Nazareth, yes? And Israel, from very early age, Israel, I learned at school that Israel is a Jewish and a democratic state, okay? But I learned very early in my years that Israel might be democratic for Israeli Jews, but it's for sure it's a Jewish state, religious, ethnic Jewish state for Palestinians. And Palestinians that live inside Israel, we consist 22% of the citizens in Israel, but we still own only 2% of the land. For example, for 22% of people, we own 2% of the land, and we are being accused of being aggressive, okay? Not the crowdness is making us more and more in a hot temper. In Israel, you know, in this area, we have different colors of ID. Maybe in the United States, you have one passport, one ID, but in Israel, you have different colors. You have the red, the orange one for Gaza, you have the green one, a green ID for West Bank. You have two blue ID colors for people living inside Israel. One for Palestinians, one blue ID for Palestinians living in Jerusalem, occupied Jerusalem, and they are considered residents. They don't have the full rights of citizenship. And the other blue ID is for Palestinians living inside Israel, like me, which give you a little more rights, but not much more. So in Israel, you are divided according to the color of your ID, but you can never be an equal citizen for an Israeli Jewish settler that came from Poland and is living in Israel. Do I have time for another, maybe very short two examples?
Yeah, you do. I just wanted to sort of locate what you're saying just a bit further, and then yes, you do have time as we started a little bit late. But there's several things that you said that really struck me. One, that there's a myth of equity from which we are working, that these arguments that of, well, maybe you deserve it, or maybe, you know, we need that, there's an assumption, a starting point that you're saying to us, actually you're starting from the wrong place, right? That the starting point was of sort of a dispossession of oppression, and now we're seeing layers and layers and layers of systemic oppression, of course, that's supported by the international community, foremost of whom is the United States. And so how can we even talk about equitable responses or assume that that's a starting point when that is the location, right? That's the sort of historical reality that we're working with. And this is the importance of the disavowed truths. The other thing is that when you're talking about IDs, of course, those of us who sort of might think about these things, it's hard not to evoke apartheid South Africa, right? Or indigenous folks in the context of settler colonial Canada, or here, where you literally needed passes to go to places, and that those passes, even if you were able to get them, if we can think about the psychological warfare that happens in having to ask for a pass to begin with, in having one, and having to organize the weight, the psychological weight of even going through that, let alone if you're allowed to, right? And then when you do, having to sort of navigate what that means. I've been on buses coming, for example, from Bethlehem into Al-Quds, Bethlehem to Jerusalem, where because of my passport, and the first time I saw, I didn't know what was happening, that I get to stay on the bus. And I want us to sort of conjure the image of this, a bus. I get to stay seated on a bus, and everybody, even though they have that ID, right, their green card, what would be a green card, have to get off the bus, right? Palestinians have to get off the bus, and kids have to get off the bus. They would ask them how old they were at a certain age, get off the bus, stand outside the bus, be checked one by one to come back onto the bus. So we have examples of this in history, right? The other thing that you were saying about land ownership, then maybe we can think about Jim Crow South, right? That you supposedly have the same rights, but in action and in policy, you don't. Right? There's still this, and I just keep thinking about the many layers of psychic trauma that you have to carry and organize and work through every day to remain connected to your sense of self. I think that's the other thing you're saying. We don't lose ourselves. We refuse the narrative of the abuser in service of retaining a sense of self, a sense of community, a sense of collectiveness.
Yes, thank you, Laura. This was great. And actually, we always teach our children who is the abuser, so that they don't get abused. And we don't have the privilege as therapists to be neutral. Actually, it's unethical to be neutral in therapy. If you don't take the context of oppression, of occupation, it's actually part of your therapeutic approach to your patients. It's unethical to be neutral. As a therapist, you have to take a position. You have to name things as it is, not only to look at the intra-psychic, but also to have a look on the general context that affected the interpersonal or intra-psychic level. I just remembered actually when I was a kid at the school, and it was a Christian school, and we wanted to finish high school. In order to get my diploma, I was instructed, me and all the Palestinians living inside Israel, that we have the blue ID card, that we are supposedly to be equal citizens. We were instructed to have tests in Torah. Torah is the religion of the Jews. And not that we were studying Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We had to study Torah and Judaism. We didn't study our own religion or all the religion issues around us. It wasn't a cultural issue. It was a way of oppression. And if you want to get your diploma, you have to take my narrative. I am your abuser. And now, yesterday, I came to Nazareth, for example, and you can see the discrimination, the oppression everywhere, even in the use of the language. For example, the name Nazareth, it's a biblical name. It has been there 2,000 years ago and before. But if you come to Nazareth, to my city, in the entrance of Nazareth, you will not see the name Nazareth, not in English, not in Arabic, in the entrance of Nazareth. You will see Nazareth Eilit, which is the Jewish city built on the lands of Nazareth. Or you will see Nasrat, which is nothing in Arabic. It's a Canaan and a Jewish name. And I can't see the name of my city, and I live here. And my grandparents live here, and their grandparents were born and lived here. Not only this, Laura, the main entrance to Nazareth, it's a tunnel. And this tunnel is named on after one of the Israeli ministers, this minister that believed in transfer meaning expelling Palestinians from their homeland. And it was his mandate in the Israeli parliament, how to expel, how to kick Palestinians, how to kick us out of our homeland. So every time I come to visit my family, I can't see the name of my city anywhere in the city, and I have to go through this mindset, reminding me that I am not welcomed in my homeland, and someone else is abusing the power and wants to kick me out. So wherever we reach as therapists, as Palestinians, even those of us living inside Israel, we didn't reach it because of the generosity and the democracy of Israel. We are where we are today on the personal and collective success level in spite of the racism of Israel, not because of its democracy. So actually, for those that you're listening to me today, I think you don't have to be, I believe actually, you don't have to be Palestinian in order to resist and reveal the truth and stand with the Palestinian people. You have only to be a decent human being. This is a justice, social, humanitarian issue. And if you are an ethical, decent, just human being, the issue of Palestine must concern us all. And we must put an end to this continuous oppression taking place on my homeland. I choose to stop here.
Yeah, perfect timing. Gurmeet is here. Oh, you're on mute, Gurmeet.
Here we go. I was saying shukran for such a enlightening and really a visual conversation. You're helping us actually see and recognize, not just hear things about your experience, which is very important. And you've addressed some of the questions that are coming in. Of course, it's not going to be possible to address all of them, but what I'm going to do is try to take up some of the questions that have been repeated, that more than one person has raised, and see, if you want to say more about it. One of the questions that several people have raised, and you started to talk about it, is, of course, the whole question of us as clinicians. And, I really appreciate your point, Yoa'd, that neutrality can become unethical. And I think that we are realizing in many ways that that can be true even in our practice in the US, how when we are dealing with racism and so on, that we have to question the definition of neutrality. What is neutrality as a clinical technique, and what is neutrality as an ethic for us as analysts? And I personally feel that neutrality is fine as a clinical technique when we are using it for a certain reason, but as an ethic, it can be really problematic. But there is a related question that came in, which is, what about trainees who are in situations where they are confronted with the racism of their supervisors, if they are, either in classes or even more importantly in supervision of individual cases, or if they perceive that their supervisors are taking a racist position with regard to patients, or pushing them to take that kind of a position, or not being sensitive to the racism involved in the clinical situation. And I wonder if that in any way comes up in your setting, and also if you have any thoughts from your experience what you would say to anyone anywhere around the world addressing that kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Gurmeet. Actually, this is what happens every day in Israel, and it's not only on the level of the individual supervisors. It's the policy of the system. For example, Palestinians who had their master's degree in Jordan have been asked to do some additional courses in order to get a work permit in Israel. These courses were planned by the Israeli Ministry of Health and were put in Ariel settlement. Ariel is a huge settlement on the lands, built on the lands of Nablus. So Palestinians wanting to get a permit to work as therapists in Israel must go through this hell and get their degree by being in a Israeli settlement and studying there. So it's not an issue of individual supervisors taking the discriminating actions. This is the system. This is how the system works. This is the policy of the ministry. And on the level of the supervisors, actually many of us, we had to work in institutes, in Israeli hospitals, and also as therapists, as trainees. Many times we go through this, we face this unethical, discriminating positions from our supervisors. And what helps us is that keeping our own lenses clear, and we always and sticking together to our Palestinian narrative, to our Palestinian colleagues. And we always suggest to trainees and young people to be connected with other Palestinian professionals so that their mindset not be disformed by these racist supervisors. Maybe Laura, yes.
Yeah, and this is directly from learning alongside you, Yoa'd, and being in conversations with you along the years. The other layer of it, and maybe this is helpful for those of us who are in training, that my understanding is also that the training, if you are in Israel proper, that the training is in Hebrew, and that most supervisors are also speak Hebrew, even though you all see folks in Arabic. So you're doing the double task of translating back to the supervisor and translating into a language that becomes legible to them, right? Which means oftentimes getting questioned about folks living in camps or having lateness read as resistance, and then you have to remind supervisors or your colleagues that it's not resistance if somebody has to wait 6 hours on a checkpoint. You can plan all day long and still come late. The other thing that you said that's really important to us and to answer the question, and I imagine it might have been from a graduate student, so those questions have a special place in my heart. We have a real technical issue, right, from technique, if we are demanding neutrality, right, from folks who themselves are under sustained oppression. And here's why. So Yoa'd tells us that in many ways she doesn't have the luxury of being neutral. Why? Because she's a Palestinian under occupation, and that all her examples she's given us, that this is a daily process that she has to navigate. So from a technical standpoint, if we still ask for neutrality, does that make Yoa'd by default a worse clinician because she can't access neutrality? We run into technical problems when we ask this, not the least of which, of course, is understanding neutrality as a code for something else. When we say neutrality, we mean human capital H, which shores up white supremacy, ableist notions of neutrality, that somehow someone has the luxury to tap out of their socio-political, socio-historical position and be able to listen neutrally. How many people have the luxury of doing that? So what does it end up meaning when we say neutrality? And the assumption that not saying anything, because that's what neutrality comes to mean, don't say anything, as though that is not also an option and not saying something. If Yoa'd is sitting across from somebody and they don't receive her and her material reality of living as a Palestinian, she's hearing something very specific from that too. That is not neutral, right? You might think you're being neutral, but she's receiving that in a very specific way, much like if we were in the middle of a pandemic, to just pretend the pandemic is not happening and somebody is suffering from it, or a member of their family has died. Just because we don't bring up the pandemic doesn't mean the pandemic hasn't already touched them and is deeply implicated in their everyday life, right? These are issues of power too.
Yeah, Lara, actually, I think it's unethical to be neutral in Palestine. Not only it's a luxury, it's unethical and unprofessional.
Thank you. Lara, since you mentioned the pandemic, a couple of different people have asked about that. So how do the conditions of oppression and discrimination, how are they impacting the effects of the pandemic? For example, what's happening with vaccination? Who gets it, who doesn't get it in Israel? I know that Israel is one of the countries that has vaccinated the greatest percentage of its population. I believe the last time I heard it was something like 25%. But how many, what percentage of that has consisted of the Palestinian population? And also with all these checkpoints and the crowding that we see in the images, what kind of danger might that be, exposing the Palestinian people to? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, of course. Regarding the COVID-19, actually, Israel got vaccination for its people, and Palestinians that got that have a blue ID, we can get the vaccination. But Palestinians can't get in West Bank and Gaza can't get vaccination unless Israel permitting it and giving us authorization to get it. So while Israel got millions of vaccinations, Palestinians get till now, I think, 5,000 portions. So it's you can see that in Palestine, in occupied Palestine, you can do nothing unless Israel give you the permit to do that. And this is a joke when they say Israel has the occupation stopped and Israel withdrew from Gaza and the West Bank. This is not the truth, because if you control the sky, if you control the sea, and if you control the land, but you're physically not there, you're just on the checkpoints and on the barriers around the wall, you're still occupying this country. So till now, Palestinians in West Bank and Gaza can't get a vaccine, and actually we think that the international community is responsible for accepting this form of reality that Palestinians can't get anything unless Israel saying yes or no. And regarding the question about the checkpoints. You know, people die on the checkpoint. Women give birth at a checkpoint. Injured babies, injured children die on the checkpoints. And we have hundreds of cases, documented cases, of people killed on the checkpoints because they were confused, not knowing which cave to go. One of our patients that had some problems and she had hearing problems, and she just missed the direct way that she was supposed to go through, and soldiers were shouting and she was panicked and she didn't understand what were they saying, and she was killed by these soldiers. So this is not only a matter of mental health issue, it's also a matter of life, and it's a matter of life and death issue, and we have to confront on daily basis.
In many ways, Yoa'd, what you're saying is that COVID complicates things, but deaths of Palestinians on checkpoints predates COVID. COVID exacerbates, much like we've seen globally, the fault lines of oppression and inequity that were already there, right? Palestinians didn't have to wait for COVID to be subject to death at checkpoints. They have always been so. And I think that that's a really powerful image for us to keep in mind. And I also want to say that under international law, and I oftentimes don't like, there are many scholars who will say using international law reinscribes the systems of oppression and gives credibility. However, I think we have recourse to international law to say, as an occupying force, if you are in West Bank and Gaza are occupied territories, as an occupying force, you have an under international law, you have a responsibility to caretake for the occupied peoples, which includes vaccinations and access to healthcare, and allowing we've heard many stories of children from Gaza not being able to receive cancer treatment and dying because they can't cross over to get appropriate care, or sending 3-year-old children without their parents to be cared for and then expected to be grateful for these services. And so again, I think when we talk about these things, we also have to consider, how does this even contradict international law, right? These are larger, and I think this is what Yoa'd, you're saying, is what is unethical about it, is that everything indicates, even if you were to follow the narrative, right, an Israeli narrative or settler colonial narrative, that you are still in contraindication of international law when you withhold care and life-saving care, in this case within COVID, or in other cases just medical care in general.
Thanks. You know, what happens in a lot of these situations is people often have a reaction to hearing things like this that goes like, yes, but, you know, and I think what I see as the purpose of this series of talks is that, in a sense, it's invitation or request to hold off on the but and to just hear a certain perspective, you know, and to just let it sit and to develop some understanding of another experience without having to say yes, but. Now, you know, there are many people who have been noticing many of the similarities with what's going on, what you're describing in Palestine, particularly around the wall, and the many walls that are being constructed around the world. And of course, there is no way to not think about, you know, the wall that was so enthusiastically being constructed by Trump in our, you know, country here in the US. So connected to that. And of course, oppressing agencies around the world do learn from each other, right? Like whether it's camps or walls or other techniques of oppressing people. We know that countries and governments learn from each other and then use them in their own countries. But there's a related issue that has also been coming up in the questions, which is that of terminology. So, when we look at walls or other policies here, in Palestine, in other places in the world, and we were talking about this even in planning this conference. What terminology is appropriate where? So, for example, if you think about racism, um, how do you think about that as a term? Does it apply? Does it not apply to the experience in Palestine? If not, what kind of terminology works best and why? Even though there are so many similarities to the oppression and to the techniques of oppression, like walls and so on, yet it seems like some terms are not necessarily usable in the same way in other places. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Actually, we think that discrimination is a much lighter terminology, that it's not enough to reflect what is happening for the Palestinian people. We think that we're confronting a regime that are trying to demolish our narrative, our people. It's an apartheid regime in every sense that you can think about it. It's a systematic, continuous, cumulative trauma used by ethnic, religious state against the native people on the ground. It's settler colonialism. It's much more than discrimination. And when I will just go again to the yes, but, when you said yes, but. Actually, as therapists, sometimes it happens to us, but the other way around. If I have a patient with an agoraphobia, I say, yes, it's an agoraphobic symptoms, but let me try to understand the symptom as part of a more general context. When this man or lady they are in continuous threat to lose their IDs, because in Palestine, if you in occupied Jerusalem, if you leave Jerusalem for the States to study or to just a trip that takes more than 6 months, you can't come back. You're not allowed to come back. So in Palestine, we all the time, as therapists, we all the time use the mindset of yes, but. Yes, it is a symptom, but let us look at the general context of apartheid taking place and try to understand the symptom, not only on the individual level, but also as part of a more general context.
I love that that's how you use that, Yoa'd, which I think is a real-time example of what you're saying about retaining the ability to think and retaining the narrative that is reality-based for you, for Palestinian folks, in service of your patients, right? Because in the end, we're also talking about clinical implications. And you're reminding us that moving away from reality, moving away from a historically based reality, is a disservice to our patients. It's a disservice to their functioning. It's a disservice to their reality testing abilities. when somebody comes in and you say, yes, but, you're reminding us, but them also, of the reality that's involved. Now, to your point, Gurmeet, the yes, but, there's always something very interesting that happens. And I got the chance to peruse some of the questions. I didn't see all of it. And I see it happening here too. And I want to name it in real time. Is that there's always a disruption that happens and an affective turmoil that happens when we start the business of naming reality. Psychoanalysis deals with the psychic and with reality, but we're much more comfortable living in the psychic because there are hard truths that come with reality. And I appreciate the space to name it. And in the same way, anytime you name reality, you risk that activation, right? Because you're disrupting a certain type of logic that has become normative, right? So in the context of the United States, we know revisionist history exists. And every time we try to speak about it, even in our circles, there's collapses that happen because naming material reality is very disruptive. So I want to own that. I want to those of you who are listening and there's a disruptive process that's happening, I think this is part of what we mean when we say reclaim disavowed truths. This activation is a part of that. And I think, Yoa'd, you're reminding us that you live in that perpetually. You live in the space of a disrupted reality of your Palestinianism, but a refusal to succumb to that and a constant reminder of what is my material reality, which you do with your students, with your supervisees, and I assume with your own children, a connectedness to that reality in service of health. If we're thinking about health, and disavowal is not in service of health, practicing what you're telling us is a part of that.
So we have only 2 minutes before it's time to stop. So I just want to give you a chance to just have the last word. And, if there's anything that you want to speak to, please do before we close.
I think that Israel experiments on a Palestinian people with all what they call security measures. And this has become a security industry, actually, which they are selling for the whole world. This is an industry, what they do. And actually, Israel is benefiting from this industry that's selling to the whole world. And we as Palestinians, we stick to our right to resist. And the terminology of terrorism must be targeted to the other entity, of course, not to the Palestinians. And part of our internal resistance is to stick to our narrative and our truth. Thank you for hearing us. We refuse to be looked at as victims. We actually want the world to see that Palestinians are survivors, and we choose to live, and we choose life. And we choose to resist on each and every level, each and every day, on the professional, academic, and family level. We are survivors, and we hope that the world will put an end to the ongoing oppression of our people. That's it.
Thank you, Maria.
Yes, I want to thank you, Yoa'd, for such a personal and rich and very meaningful presentation. And Lara and Gurmeet, thank you for the moderation, but also thank you for making those parallels between what's happening in Palestine and Israel and in Canada and the US. And as we continue our studies around the globe, we're hoping to learn more about how oppression exists in everywhere, and what we can learn and see as similarities. I also want to thank everyone for being here today. Some of the guests have asked about books, so if you have some references, we will send those along. People have also asked about recordings. For those of you who missed our first meeting with Bill Moyers and Carol Jenkins, it is recorded and is on the Institute's YouTube channel. We hope that this presentation will also be on the Institute's YouTube channel. So we will send that information around. And finally, we hope you will join us on March 20th when we return to look at the US. Our speaker will be Spencer Crew, and he was the director of the National Museum of the African American History and Culture. And our moderator will be Tom Hennis, who is a trustee of the William Allenson White Institute and a founder and principal of Think Design. So thank you all for being with us today for this very rich and interesting presentation, and we hope to see you in a few more weeks. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
شكرا لارا.